So I'm scrolling Instagram the other day and I find news that I am not expecting to see, and you guys would not have expected to see it either. Nate Diaz was on a podcast and he said that he plans to come back to the UFC and there are 3 opponents in mind that he wants to face. And on top of that, Nate Diaz said that the reason that he has not been fighting in the UFC is due to there being no names currently that are worth him fighting. And the 3 fighters he said he will fight when he returns to the UFC will be revealed later in the video. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, consider subscribing. Now would be the coolest time to subscribe because when we become a big channel, you can look back and be like, oh, I was with this guy from the start, and that'd just be the coolest thing ever. But back to the video. So to address the first part of what he said, that he hasn't been fighting in the UFC because there are no active fights. Well, what Nate Diaz would be fighting in is the lightweight division, and talking about there have been no active fights, we've had fighters like Islam Makhachev, Charles Oliveira, we now have Ilia Topuria, we had Max Holloway, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje. All these people are stars within UFC and in MMA as a whole and would have been great fights for Nate Diaz, and they are definitely names that he could have fought. But he just chooses to act like there have been no names in the lightweight division. And that's not even mentioning other great fighters like Rafael Fiziev, Dan Hooker, Arman Sarukian, and many others. Now, I told you guys I'd tell you the 3 fighters that Nate Diaz said he wanted to fight upon return to UFC was Conor McGregor, Ilia Topuria, and Max Holloway. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's probably the most ridiculous thing you've heard all week. Because 1, Conor McGregor is not fighting the UFC. He hasn't fought in the UFC in years, and Dana White was just asked last week when Conor McGregor would make his return to the UFC, and Dana White said that it would not be anytime soon, so that's out of the question. And then the next option he said was Max Holloway, who sure he could fight Max Holloway, but Max Holloway is still at the tail end of his prime. Max Holloway coming off of a win against Justin Gaethje. I know he lost to Ilia Topuria, but Ilia Topuria is one of the best fighters in the world. If Nate Diaz came out of retirement at his age and stepped into the UFC and fought Max Holloway in his current form, Nate Diaz gets knocked out in round 1. I know Nate Diaz has this crazy cardio, but he's not making it to round 2 against one of the best boxers in the UFC and in MMA as a whole when you haven't fought in years. And then the third and final fighter he named was Ilia Topuria. I don't have to tell you guys about Ilia Topuria. I just made a video on him in my last video talking about how good he is and his upcoming fight with Charles Oliveira, so go watch that if you like. But Ilia Topuria is coming off the 2 most impressive wins in UFC history, and they're both title fights where he beat the featherweight GOAT Alex Volkanovski to claim the title, and then defended the title against the 2nd or 3rd best featherweight of all time being Max Holloway, and he knocked both of these fighters out. He's undefeated in the UFC. He is currently 16-0, looking to be 17-0. And if Nate Diaz comes out of retirement at his grandpa age to step in there against Ilia Topuria, he's getting flatlined within the first 2 rounds, and that is final. You would be silly to argue otherwise. Maybe Nate Diaz in 2016, yes, almost a decade ago, could go longer with Ilia Topuria, maybe even beat Ilia Topuria. I don't know about all that, but Nate Diaz in his current age, a decade removed from his prime, is not beating or even having a competitive fight with either of those 2 named people, and the third, Conor McGregor, doesn't even fight anymore. Now let's look at Nate Diaz's latest UFC fights. Since beating Conor McGregor in 2016, Nate Diaz has gone on to lose to Conor McGregor in 2016. Beat Anthony Pettis, which is a win, but it's not that impressive of a win. Anthony Pettis was never one of the best fighters in the world, or even his division in my opinion. And then he goes on to lose to Jorge Masvidal, lose to Leon Edwards, both those fights in 2019, and then in 2022 he beats a washed up Tony Ferguson. Do any of those fights, and those are fights in the past 9 years, do any of those fights impress you? I would say no. And then this guy's gonna talk about coming back to fight Ilia Topuria or Max Holloway? That is top tier delusion. There's no way that's gonna happen, and if it did happen, Nate Diaz would get smoked. It would not be a close fight. I love Nate Diaz as much as the next person. He's one of the fighters that got me into the UFC, but him saying this is just absolutely ridiculous and shows he has no idea what is going on in the UFC today, and is just lost touch with the reality of his skill and his current age. And yes, that's the next point I'm going to bring up. Nate Diaz is 40 years old. Name one fighter ever who's coming out of retirement at 40 years old and looking good or even close to as they did before they retired. And especially if you're going to come out of retirement at 40 years old, you got to be fighting other old heads. You got to fight a Jim Miller or somebody. You cannot come in here and fight Ilia Topuria or Max Holloway at 40 years old off of retirement, bro. You are not Tom Brady. You are not Michael Jordan. You are going to get knocked out and look silly if you do this. The most recent Nate Diaz fight we see is his match against Jake Paul, in which he lost to Jake Paul, who is a YouTuber doing exhibition boxing matches. And then how can you forget the super competitive boxing match Nate Diaz had with Jorge Masvidal? That's his other recent fight he has in recent years, in the last 5 years. And this is the guy who's talking about coming back to fight the best and most brutal strikers in the world in Ilia Topuria and Max Holloway. That is just speed running CTE, and I don't think the UFC should even sanction that fight. Those would be ridiculous fights. Nate Diaz would get smoked, and it would just be a joke at the end of the day. Looking at all the ranked fighters in the lightweight division, I can't tell you one that I would put money for Nate Diaz to beat these days. There is not one. Maybe a prime Nate Diaz, but not a 40-year-old Nate Diaz in 2025. It's just ridiculous, and fighters need to stop talking like this. But anyways, that's all I got for this video. You guys let me know down below, is Nate Diaz beating any of those named fighters or any fighter in the lightweight division? And if so, who? I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. Subscribing and liking is free, and I respond to every comment, so I appreciate all the support I get, and I'll see you guys in the next video later this week. Deuces.